Welcome to the Week in Sports Cars on the Marshall Pruett podcast, brought to you by Cooper Tires, the Justice Brothers, and also our friends during the race week at Le Mans, Ginetta Cars. We are recording this on a Monday afternoon in California. It is definitely almost bedtime for you in France. Graham Goodwin from dailysportscar.com. Boring race. Nothing to talk about. Nothing happening post-event either, right, brother? This is going to be a quick one. All right, thanks for listening. Talk to you next week.
No, that's not true at all, is it? It's been, how can we put this, a nightmare of an evening. Waiting for quite a while for some issues that we knew were out there to see whether or not there would be issues that became public that needed resolving. And as you and I both know, we're recording this probably, a couple of hours later than we otherwise would have been, MP, because there have been dramas on a Monday evening. I'm sitting here it's with the family home we stayed with for 20 years at Le Mans, and it seems very deja vu to me. After last year, post-race technical inspection saw multiple penalties imposed. That was in LMP2 as well as in GT Pro last year. In that case, with driver time infringements for two of the Fords. But this evening, huge dramas for two different Ford teams, but most dramatic of all, MP, for Keating Motorsport.
We have an expression here in the United States, and I won't use it this early in the show in its entirety. I'll leave folks to fill in the word that I won't use, but as we love our American football here, there's the expression monkey fornicating a football. And let's just say that old football, whew, boy, it has seen better days coming out of the 24 hours of Le Mans. So we've got a lot of questions. I know that might come as a surprise, but coming out of the event, we already had plenty on the finish, overall finish, questions of skullduggery between the number 7 and number 8 Toyotas. Let's see, just a variety of things, not to mention Hypercar as well. So we still have all those. We'll still get to those. We should definitely start on the matters of the day, this being the disqualifications of the number 68 Ford Chip Ganassi Racing GT Graham, which finished 4th overall in GTE Pro, Ford's swan song. So that is now no longer the 4th place finishing car. All 4 Ganassi Fords finished in a row, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th. So this moves up the 3 sister cars 1 position. Then we have the overall winning GT-E-Am Ford GT, entered by Raleigh Motorsports, owned by Ben Keating, driven by Ben, Jerome Bleekemolen, and Felipe Fraga, who are no longer, not just the winners, they're no longer listed as participants in the race. I figure before we get to that, or before we get fully into that, I'll just give folks a little bit of a timeline. And that is, as some of you know, before I started doing this little media thing, I was a team guy working on pit crews, mechanic, and otherwise. And so as a result, end up knowing a lot of people, and had started hearing shortly after the race, Graham, maybe an hour and a half after the race. And this wasn't coming out of the Riley Motorsports team, so I want to be completely clear about that, but was just hearing from some others that it really seemed like post-race there was an effort to get the number 85. And by get, I don't know how we should define that. And I'm not saying that's accurate. I'm just saying there was a definite feeling that there was an effort afoot to make sure that that car did not hold on to its overall win. Why don't you explain the sequence, Graham, of how what was handed down? There were actually 2 steps of revealings from the ACO and FIA on what happened to the 85 and how that ultimately changed the overall record, finishing record for GTE-Am, because it's a whopper.
It is a lump, and it came in a kind of unfortunate order. We were aware after the decision that came a little early this evening about the 68 car losing its 4th position in GT Pro. We were fully aware the 85 car was in some potential difficulty, not least because a couple of my colleagues at Daily Sports Car were on site in the circuit this afternoon. Could clearly see the car was still being examined, and there were two decisions made against it. The first was made to do with the refueling rig, and the refueling rig, it should be a minimum fuel time for a full fill of 45 seconds. It was fueling just slightly quicker than that. That was judged to be worthy of a time penalty of 55.2 seconds, I think it was, which would have been enough to drop the car to second. And in particular, by the way, what we should say here is it's not just that they've lost the win, they've also lost the automatic entry to the Le Mans for next year for that car. So that's a very significant penalty in its own right. Within minutes of that, we then got a second steward's decision, which was the one that I was expecting in the first place, because this was what our intelligence was telling us had actually occurred, which was that the fuel capacity of the car was over that prescribed by its balance of performance. In other words, that defines the amount of fuel the car is allowed to carry as a maximum capacity. And there's the facts, and then there's a little more of a clarification. It's slightly complicated. Something like 100 millilitres over. So instead of 96 litres, 96.1 litres measured. But that's without draining the entire fuel system and what remains in the tank. That would mean that it would be over the 96 litres by a margin. Quite exactly what margin, I can't actually tell you. Certainly not by the margin that the 68 car was over. That was something like a litre over its prescribed maximum. So two infringements, two separate penalties, the first of which was a substantial time penalty of coming on for a minute, 55 point something, which would have put it second in the order, but then very rapidly confirmed as a full disqualification and exclusion from the event for the two infringements. So huge penalty for the Keating car. First thing to say is rules are rules. No doubt about that whatsoever. I think it's fair to say, though, MP, and I'm sure this is the way that you and others are feeling about this, there was something about the way in which the end of that race transpired and the way in which events came to pass that just did not feel right. I feel the need to seek clarification about why the car was called in for the repair on the nose, despite the fact we'd seen other GT cars with not dissimilar damage that we certainly had not heard. There were calls for those cars to be brought in. We then got the immediately subsequent penalty for Ben Keating for spinning the wheels on exit. Ben then did a great job fending off an attack from Jörg Bergmeister, kept the car ahead until he could get the car back onto pit lane for its final stop. Jerome Bleekemolen doing the business to bring the car home. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, never have been, but this doesn't feel quite right. That certainly didn't feel quite right. If there are technical infringements, then sorry, but there are technical infringements. And generally speaking, if there's a technical infringement around BOP or around fuel rigs, etc., it will tend to be a pretty hefty penalty. Of that, there is not a great deal of surprise. But something about the events here that have led to the point we sit at now, something like midnight on Monday in France, just feels quite uncomfortable.
Let me throw a couple of different things at this, Graham, before we keep moving along on our little show here. And thank you, by the way, for you and Stephen Kilby doing an awesome job while I had to step away for a couple of weeks. And I'm hoping that we can have Stephen on semi-regularly, if he's a good lad. Only if he's a good lad. But thanks for that. A couple things here. I have a pretty good understanding that Ben Keating was looking at something like a 5-year commitment to doing Le Mans with this Ford GT, had really planned big on wanting to make this an annual affair. I fear that plan might have been axed with the disqualification. I had heard about, and I don't want to say heard like whispers, I mean real true intel that to me there was unquestionable fairly early this morning, California. and had heard that it was the amount of overage was something close to 100 milliliters. I've since learned with additional intel that it is below that. So I would say the 96.1 liter number mentioned in the disqualification paperwork is a rounding up to 0.1, 96.1. I won't go into much more on that, but I am very confident that it is not exactly 91.00, but it is fairly close, therefore rounding up. No big deal there. If it's over, it's over. A couple of other things here, Graham. My guess is the way things might have transpired within race control in relation to the 85 car on this very specific topic of refueling faster than the rules allow. The rules, as you mentioned, said 45 seconds minimum time for refueling. They were found to have been 0.6 seconds too fast across 23 pit stops. The math provided by the ACO said they multiplied that 0.6 times 23, then multiplied that by 4 to get their 55.2 second penalty. Had that been what it was in and of itself, it would have moved the 85 Ford to second place behind the Team Project 1 Porsche 911 RSR, would have effectively gone from winning by 44.9 seconds to losing, although still finishing second by, I think, 10.3 seconds. So that was the original thing that came down. If we look at, Graham, just the times that these were signed off on, the original you refueled too quickly 23 times penalty was signed off on at 8:30 in the morning in France. The exclusion was signed off at what I believe 10:23, fairly late. I actually might be off on that. Regardless, effectively, at least by my math, 14 hours later. Now, I'm not saying that we all learned about the refueling too fast penalty at 8:30 in the morning. Just saying, looking at when these documents were signed off on, there was one effectively in the morning, one very, very late in the evening. Both of those were distributed to reporters such as yourself, myself, and a handful of others within a fairly short amount of time of one another. So you take those things, and at least for what I know, which was the scrutineers paid visits to the 85 garage to look at and inspect the overhead refueling tank, my guess, Graham, tell me if you think this might be the sequence of what happened. And none of this has anything to do with conspiracy theories. This is just trying to think it through logically. If we recall how IMSA, a couple of years ago, handed down a big penalty to the Land Motorsport team that was kicking everyone's butt in GTD, they were able to assess there was something going different than expected via live telemetry. Its time on pit lane was different than what they expected. On went the procedures that led to that car receiving a penalty, etc. My guess is the ACO saw through telemetry that the refueling was taking less than the 45 seconds expected, dispatched scrutineers to take a look, and from that point, there was a pretty solid decision that, there is something happening out of expectation here, quote, out of regulation. What makes me wonder, Graham, or I want to hear your thought, is the really wonky makes no sense. You've been running with the damaged front bumper forever decision. Come in, you got to change that out of nowhere. And Barabon had been put over it. There are no structural issues. There's nothing flying off of it. The really random decision to make them do that while holding a fairly sizable lead makes me wonder if the race folks in race control were trying to quietly manage this very small, but nonetheless afoul of the rules, refueling time violation by trying to get them onto pit lane to serve a, quote, penalty that might compensate for that more than ably, and yet it was not enough to, call it, pay a penalty to give away first place. And then we had the following rule of coming in to serve a penalty for spinning the tires. Part of me thinks, if not a lot of me thinks, Graham, this really wonky thing we can't quite explain with the forced call to pit lane to change the nose was actually being done so they didn't have to do this post-race scrutineering bit and ultimately disqualify the car.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? And I think the honest answer is we can't be sure until we can actually get to speak to those directly involved in the decision-making process. It's not the work of a moment, I have to tell you, with an FIA World Championship. Let's wait and see on that front. Either way, very, very sad evening for all concerned in both those cars. Look, I mean, for me, at worst, mistakes have been made. There's some oddness about the timings. You're absolutely right. I think the reason behind the lateness of this decision is that a second test was ordered, because if you look at the decision numbers, if nothing else, decision 122 and 123 were the 85 car adjudications. Decision 146 was the 68 car, and we got that earlier. But I think that's because of the net result of what befell the 85 and the significance of that to the overall race results, and the fact that they actually asked for and ordered a second test with the team present. Team, by the way, I should say, made very clear on the steward's decision they will not be appealing that decision. So they accept that decision, I guess you could take from that. It's just very sad. And, you know, it's a tricky one, isn't it? The reality is rules are rules. If rules are broken, there are penalties for those rules. But this is the second consecutive Le Mans where we've had significant, in both cases, class-winning cars excluded on the day after the race. How much longer is it going to be before that's a winner overall if we carry on like this? The reality is here, something really needs to change in terms of the way in which these processes are dealt with. Because the one thing, by the way, that is common to both the 68 and to the 85 in terms of the defence that is given, it is the changes that were made to adapt the cars for the balance of performance which changed before the race. That appears to have caused the problem. Now that, you know, if all of that is correct, is nothing other than a mistake by the teams concerned. That's what it is. But again, it's a point subsequent to a balance of performance process that seems to struggle through Le Mans week. Seems to have difficulties with it every year. We've got a very unhappy Aston Martin team, for instance, very unhappy indeed that they feel they were unfairly penalised with their BOP.
What do you mean?
That ruined their race.
Their first 3 or 4 laps of the race were phenomenal. I mean, if you just ignore the rest, yeah. And look, I don't want to be the American guy who's always kind of pooping on the French here. I'll just say this. The ability to fully enjoy the 24 hours of Le Mans in light of the post-race penalties, I would say it's becoming diminished enough to the point to where, however next year's race plays out, without some significant reconsiderations of how things are done, I'm going to look at this as a really awesome, let's just call it kind of a pickup game. Bunch of folks showing up in the park having fun, shooting the ball around. You know, yeah, we'll keep score, but it doesn't really mean anything. Then you wait until the next day to find out what the true results were. I know that this 2 years in a row is not exactly a massive, it's not a 10-year trend, but it's just something where you go, if you're going to invest this much time, fans in general, you really want to ask, are there other methods you might employ? In this case, pre-race fuel cell capacity. I mean, let every single car, whatever your capacity is, go through tech, have everything signed off, have everything truly locked down with scrutineering seals and you name it. We're going to do all of this to try and think of anything possible that might get you bounced post-race. We're going to do pre-race checks on everything possible we can think of to keep you from running afoul of the rules so that our results have the highest probability of standing.
I guess the other thing to add into this, MP, is this: that the more separate issues you apply through BOP or regulation, the more opportunity there is to try and game it or to get it wrong. And, you know, I think you're right. I think if actually we're going to get to the stage where these things are going to be changed pre-race, it would seem to be sensible, wouldn't it, that they are the things you check. If you've already scrutinized the cars, you then make a change to the balance of performance. Surely it makes sense that those very details are checked before the race.
I like where you're going there. And again, the heating penalty for the 0.1 excess on fuel capacity, I have no issue with that. It's a tiny amount. It's truly a tiny amount. But again, applied over 23 pit stops, it's, at least in American math, it's a little over a half gallon of go faster, go longer juice.
I guess the reality though, MP, is I don't disagree. It is a technical infringement and the penalties apply. But here's the rub: it didn't make a difference. It doesn't make the car go another lap. It doesn't. There are limits to the amount of fuel that car can use over a stint, and the reality is that they were not using more than that amount. So it is an extreme penalty for a small mistake, but that's what the rules say, and the team have accepted that. And they've accepted it with good grace. Now, the effects on whether or not they'll want to be coming back remain to be seen.
And you raise a great point there. That 0.1 per refueling instance was never used. No car let me rephrase that. No car that is moving forward under its own power uses every last drop of fuel. There's always a few tenths of a gallon, if not a gallon, half gallon left in the tank when each car pits. That's just standard practice. But nonetheless, regardless of whether it was used or not, the 96 liters was the known maximum. It was exceeded. I get that. I also like your point, as we move on, of maybe there's a question of over-regulation. Not as if this is new and we've never spoken about this 1,000 times before, but if every little thing is regulated, crew members can only take 17 steps while changing a tire. The wheel gun can only go this particularly fast, this many RPMs, and it's been measured to go 5 RPMs too fast, therefore giving you a wheel tightening advantage. And I mean, again, we can get down to regulating it. Oh, your crew members have been limited to 2,000 calories of food intake over so many hours at the race and so many liters of liquids. And I mean, we can measure everything, Graham. We can measure every damn thing, come up with parameters. This is legal. This is a foul. Just to your point, which I love, if you want to try and come up with numbers for everything and seemingly make everything some sort of rule to follow, it sure does get harder every year to make sure that everybody complies with them. So it's a mindset that our friends at the ACO and FIA just might reconsider, seeing how their biggest race, their crown jewel, the world's biggest, most everythingest motor race, boy, 2 years in a row, pretty significant disappointment and controversy in final results. So we have one other really grumpy topic we can get into, which I think we'll save because I don't want to start the show with two grumpy guys ranting, get off our lawn. But at least when we're talking about the Eurosport broadcast, and as someone who recorded the whole thing and watched the majority of it, I thought last year's was the worst I'd ever seen. Well, you know what? Since I am an optimist, I am a glass half full guy. They exceeded my expectations, Graham. It got even worse this year. But let's save that for a little bit later because we have a couple of questions that have come in from folks. Since you are dialing in on your phone and unable to get to the questions, I'm going to be the guy that reads them. So let's get into these questions. Some of them are very pertinent to what we discussed already. Some of them are just a little bit random. And we're just going to do that this week, friends. Instead of doing the IMSA section and this, we're just going to go through them because it is kind of a hodgepodge. We're going to go to Dr. Daniil. who says, what might the ACO have been trying to achieve by knocking out the @timing_71 timing service? Why this year and not previously? And I did see a number of folks rather grumpy that the official timing scoring feed was seemingly no longer made available for this external service that some folks really come to enjoy.
I think the answer here, it's a difficult one, isn't it? The answer here is, initially, from memory, the WC websites and the free aspects of the app did not have any timing and scoring on it at all. That was made clear from competitors, from media, as well as from a very large proportion of the fan base. That was not acceptable. So what you've really got now available to the public, without any payment, is sort of timing light. And it's certainly not what I would use when I'm in a broadcast booth for WC or in the press room when we get the rather more full Alcamel service. What we're talking about here is a free, fair use, aggregated service, if you like, that draws data from all sorts of places. For me, it's not so much the decision, it's the timing of the decision, because the decision was apparently made and communicated to the owner of this online timing service really rather late. I guess there are two sides to this. Am I happy about it? Of course I'm not happy about it. But there is a point here that data source is owned by somebody. And if actually what you're doing is drawing traffic, whether or not you're currently offering that commercially, the owner of that data is entitled to question whether or not there is a commercial aspect to it, and in cases where they don't have the answers to that question, ask the question of you, or indeed ask you to cease and desist while they establish the answer to that question. The problem in this instance is it did not leave enough time for any conversation or negotiation, even if, by the way, there was any intention to ever negotiate or just ask you to stop. Either way, anything that's going and making the enjoyment of my sport more for a wider audience, I think is a good thing. I happen to think it's a very bad thing that the part of the show that I contribute to most often, the ACO TV, the WEC TV app, the fact that is behind a paywall, I think is a bad thing. I've thought it's been a bad thing from day one of doing it. And I think it's a bad thing again this year. And, whilst I'll be slightly restricted in my comments about other broadcasting colleagues, I don't disagree with the sentiment.
Would it be fair to suggest, knowing that this is, again, something that did not belong to the folks providing this external timing and scoring service, and they're the only ones, there are a couple others out there, knowing that this was not their data and this is something that has been monetized, I can see you can look at it one way and say, it was left very late to inform them that it would be rescinded. I also think of the flip side of they had plenty of time to ask, hey, so we want to use your data. What would that cost? Would it cost anything? What can we do here? So I don't put this entirely on the ACO /FIA. As a photographer, I get these fun interactions, as do every photographer I can think of. Hey, I see that you have taken my photo and you are using it somehow to promote your thing or whatever. And please don't do that because you did not ask and it doesn't belong to you. And the inevitable response is, oh, hey man, A, whatever. And B, well, if anything, you should be happy because I'm helping to promote you and your thing. And you go, yeah, I trust me. I wish that worked in the real world. Well, I'll give you credit. Really? You're going to be kind enough to take my work for your benefit, and then you're going to be kind enough to give me credit for my own work? Amazing. Can you show me how, when I have to pay for whatever it is, show me the gave me credit option for paying my bills? I wish I'm going to go down to the local dealership and take a car off the lot, brand new, and drive it home. And if they call the police, but hey, I'm going to give you credit for letting me have the car. And aren't you going to benefit by seeing me drive it around? Try that at a restaurant. Try that at a convenience store. Hey, I'm just going to walk out with the Pepsi here. And, well, folks are going to see me drinking Pepsi. And, I'm going to tell them, hey, I got it from this store. It's just this fantastical thinking. Now, I'm not applying all of that to our dear friends here with the timing and scoring service. Just saying just the general idea of it's not yours. You could have asked. It sounds like you didn't. And when the people who owned it made a decision to say, no, you can't just keep having it for free, there might not have been time to react. But again, I wouldn't paint the ACO and FIA as the villains here. And nor am I saying that you were. There was options both ways to probably try and end up at a happier place. I'm going to go to Paul Marsden. He says, how badly were Aston screwed by balance of performance? Or were there other factors at play? How can they improve the process before Hypercar? I don't understand how they can get enough comparable data of clear laps and qualifying to make reasonable adjustments. I'd also ask you, Graham, to maybe share your thoughts, hashtag you personally, on the post-qualifying pre-race BOP adjustment thing, that super crazy window of, by the way, we're going to change things with no real time for you to get on track and find out how to adjust for that as well.
It's a brilliant question, and I think what's most interesting about this is the reaction we're getting from a number of other players that have not yet declared for Hypercar or anything else, which are basically saying, look, we need to be reassured this can work, the budgets are right, the balance of performance will work, etc., etc. And it would be fair to say that there is some credibility to be built by the ACO on that front. This is not going to be easy. We've seen first film of the base car, if you like, for the Toyota Hypercar today. It's the same film that was actually shown at the press conference announcing the program. We know more or less what the Valkyrie will bring. I've got a little bit more technical detail. I've managed to squirrel out of a couple of contacts about that car as well. And the reality is you're going to be fundamentally different machines. You're talking effectively Toyota TS050 Lite is what I would think it would be worth saying the GR Supersport concept. Then you've got the Valkyrie, and that led to one of the best answers I've been given in recent memory at a press conference. It came from Dr. Andy Palmer, the man at the head of Aston Martin, when he was asked, what will you have to do to get the Valkyrie to the performance window applied for Hypercar, to which the answer was detune it a bit. In other words, you're dealing with a kind of road-going Hypercar that it's the top end of the abilities of road-going cars. Those parameters have been put in place for some, well, let's be blunt, lesser cars that will follow on. I think they've got one hell of a task on their hands. It has led me to ask the question whether or not they think they've got enough capacity in their technical department. Vincent Pomenil basically said to me at the press conference he felt that they had. I remain to be convinced. I think this is a different league altogether from what we've actually seen with BOP for the GTE Pro class. And on that front, by the way, just a final word on that one, we've got to get to the stage where manufacturers and teams grow out of this sandbagging nonsense, because that's what's causing the issues as we're coming to these big races. For God's sake, guys, play the game well, because otherwise it's just going to be a round robin of farce and confusion. In this instance, it's pretty clear that Aston Martin think they were shafted, and shafted royally. They think they showed what they got. They think they were punished for doing that. They think that others got away with it. And the results would seem to indicate that that was probably the case.
Can I throw something in here, Graham, that it's not meant to be a soapbox. This is the tiniest Bushu's Hammer Emporium soapbox moment. This is never going to change. This is never going to change. This post-race, we got screwed, BOP, the post-test day then leading into qualifying, having a poor qualifying, we got screwed. They adjusted us in whichever direction we got weight. We had less air to breathe. We had less turbo. This is never going to change. This is always going to be the story in IMSA, especially at the 24 Hours of Le Mans, especially when we have these. We are done with qualifying Thursday evening at midnight, and we go racing, 36 whatever plus hours later, and you have no real time other than a very brief warm-up session the morning of the race to figure out how this change has affected fuel capacity, brake wear, blah, blah, blah. Fuel consumption, not fuel capacity. This is going to happen always, and the story will never change until manufacturers stand up in IMSA, in the 24 Hours of Le Mans, in the WEC, in wherever BOP is used, and say, no, not going to do it anymore. Until that day, until we go back to a rather simple older formula of pick your engine displacement and cylinders and weight, and here is the related air restrictor that might go with that. You're picking your formula, knowing what you're going to get beforehand, run everything, do all your simulation before you say we're going to do this, this, and the other. Until we go back to those days, which made for some pretty epic racing, and there were definite haves and have-nots, but it was based on merit, not people sitting in a room typing values into spreadsheets and otherwise dictating whether an Aston Martin can go from being on pole to having its ass handed to it in the race. Until we get away from folks that you maybe have never met and will never meet, don't know their names, but they indeed are the folks pulling the strings behind the race, not to be evil, but just because they have the power to do so and do. Until we want to get away from that, it sounds like you're about to be arrested. There's some sort of alarm going off.
No, it's. I'll let you finish the point. I'll tell you exactly
what it's all good. But until we get away from that being an accepted thing, I'm not saying that Aston Martin, name whichever teams, whichever brands and manufacturers, don't have a right to be upset when things are, when incorrect values are typed into what is outputted for their BOP. But until we get away from that, folks know what they're getting. Folks know this is going to be the story every year. Corvette was the somewhat recent recipient of the why did you even bother showing up? There's no reason to be here. The BOP is so far off. Why race this year? Man, except for an ill-timed incident and another problem in terms of pace, they could have won the thing. The passing the hat of who is going to be happy and who is going to suck, it's going to be driven by BOP every year until manufacturers unite and say, nope, we have to change the way we do this. It's just going to be the norm. This is the conversation we're guaranteed to have every year.
I think you can probably gather that the ringing bell early was the level crossing I'm sitting quite close to with the train going by. I don't disagree. There are lots of choices that need to be made here, aren't there? Choices by manufacturers, choices by race organisers and regulators. It doesn't get us away from, does it? It's quite a depressing cycle to come back and still be talking about these same, frankly, shitty matters after what should be the world's greatest motor races. And it's not just Le Mans. Remember the Land Motorsport issue at the Daytona 24 Hours. We've had it at WC races, we've had it in MS races. I'm sure we've had it in IMSA races too.
We are not singling out the ACO and FIA for this. It's just a case where when their biggest race is also our biggest race, the biggest race in the world, the defining motor race for sports car fans, when this is the news every year, and there's always, we've come up with a different process. We've got better people. We've got different software. Everything is always improving every year if you accept and swallow what you're told. And I'm sure folks genuinely believe that at the variety of organizations that use BOP. And what happens every year, Graham? The same damn thing. So, again, if you are going to buy in to this evil, you kind of have to accept that evil is going to be visited upon you at some point until everyone collectively says, hey, no more evil. Let's do things differently. So until we get there, I feel bad for those negatively affected by it, but you know what you're getting yourself into, man. You're willfully signing up for this garbage technical balancing thing that never works. All right, I'm stepping off the Bushu Hammer Emporium soapbox.
The one thing I'll add, by the way, to all of that is we get two choices. We've either got a position whereby there's outright bias. There's outright bias against a particular manufacturer, a particular team, or there's not. Or Ford are being punished and BMW are being punished because they're no longer in the WEC. Maybe that's a thing. But if that's all true, how can you possibly then equate that to Aston Martin getting a shitty BOP mere minutes after announcing the thing that saves Hypercar? The thing. That I cannot get my head around. Is it just that we have got to the stage where this is just so disjointed, where this is so now... the technical side of things is so imperious that it's out of control? Is that where we are? Because if that's where we are, that's a very unfortunate place to be.
As I have said for many years, sports car racing is 100% driven by rules and regulations. And this is just further affirmation that this happens to be the case. There's now a feeling that Formula One is becoming that way, especially, Graham, after the Canadian Grand Prix ruling. The motor racing series where the feeling is, yes, you have rules and yes, you adhere to them, but the racing is actually what you are here for, not the adherence of 1,000 little rules. It just makes it hard, I think, for some, not everybody, but for some, to really say, gosh, that was amazing. It's been a little while. It feels like it's been too long, Graham, since we left a major endurance race and did not feel that some sort of buggering went on or balancing mishap took place. The desire to say, man, that was an awesome race, and have no other thoughts to add other than it was awesome.
Well, I can give you one final example here, MP, and this is across WEC and European Le Mans Series. Not that long ago, I think it may have been 2 seasons ago, we had 5 consecutive races between the ELMS and the WEC where we did not leave the press room before about 1 and in one case 2 a.m. because there were still issues to be dealt with from post-race technical inspection. And that was not the Le Mans 24 hours. They were regular races. The case of Le Mans, it is different. Technical inspection does not take place immediately after the race. It takes place and starts on Monday morning for obvious reasons. Everybody's completely shattered after a 24-hour race. But, we had this 5 consecutive times with effectively the same rule set. Somebody, somewhere, should be taking a view on what needs to be done to stop that from happening. And I don't have the answer. I don't have the answer. It's one thing you could say is, look, there are rules. Everybody knows the rules. If you apply the rules evenly, there should be no favours given. There should be no quarter given. And if you break the rules, then there was a sanction applied. But equally, we are in the entertainment business. And in the entertainment business, that things are basically immediate. What you see on your TV, on your app, on your computer screen should be what you expect to see reported in newspapers the following day. And if it's not, then something's broken. It needs to be thought through.
Let me mention something here that's just kind of fun and unrelated. Just taking a look at our little statistics, and this is also very much thanks to you and Stephen Kilby and Jim Roller and a lot of great podcasts coming out of Le Mans. We are at 2,998.4 thousand downloads right now on our little podcast since it debuted in May of 2016. And yeah, I believe we crossed the 2 million threshold. We'll have to look up the exact day. I don't know. I'm thinking it was like November 5th, 6th, 7th, something like that.
I think it was November. So
Yeah, we've put up another 1 million downloads, my friend, in not a whole lot of time. The very first year, from whatever, middle of May 16 through middle of May 17, took us a year to do 650,000 downloads. So, yeah, the fact that we're doing 1 million in well under a year, yeah. Let's keep rocking it out, my friend.
Well, I'll tell you what, while we're on that just not quite that subject, but just to complete the cycle, this race week, with a little bit of help from our friends at Ginetta Cars. And here's a couple of things about Ginetta that come out from this week. We did say all the way through the week they had some exciting news. That exciting news was their new LMP3 car. I'd seen the renders. It looked pretty nice, but renders always do, don't they? You don't generally see a bad-looking render. First time I actually had the opportunity to see the car in the carbon was on Friday. That thing is stunning. It's stunning. It doesn't look like a kind of loosely collected, body of parts around a spec drivetrain. It looks absolutely fantastic. The Ligier looks good. The Audace, maybe not so much. We've not really seen the Duquesne. Ginetta looks great. The second thing, and this will be in the post-race notebook for Daily Sports Car tomorrow.
Hashtag breaking exclusive scoop.
Well, this one's a cracker. This came very late at night in one of the breaks from my duties on TV. I popped down to see what was going on with the Dragon Speed team and had a chat with team owner Elton Julian. They were massively struggling with their BR1 with the Gibson engine, which was moments away from actually going out for what proved to be its last venture out into the darkness. And there was a quote there from Elton that reveals something I've known, and I think you've known for a while, but we were just basically being diplomatic and not showing this information.
Go on, you have fabulous hair. That's the news we've been waiting to tell the world.
If all things have been equal, and if Elton's wishes had been followed, then that BR1 would never have started Le Mans, and a Ginetta would have done instead.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't say this in a happy way, but we arrived at the point before Le Mans where you could write, and the Dragon Speed BR1 is slowing because of, circle one of the two, gearbox/electronics. And I believe they were struck by both throughout the event before we got into the race. So, yeah, not a whole lot of fun. All right, let's keep rocking on Twitter here, and then we're going to move over to Facebook as I stutter. We're going to go to James Hewitt, and this was sent in 6 hours ago before some of the news we discussed in the open of the show. Just how much of a sign of relief was it to have such positive news from Le Mans this week? I, for one, am incredibly relieved. Also, this podcast is awesome, so long may it continue. Well, thank you, James. It's going to continue for as long as we, as long as we can think of stuff to talk about. So let's wind the clock back a little bit, Graham. Pretend that today never happened. Pretend that some of the silliness towards the end of the race, either in P1 or GTE-AM, took place. Some of the safety car-ish type stuff didn't seem to bake in the GTE Pro result. Seems like LMP2 might be the only one where there's nothing of real question to bring up. But yeah, in general, this hypercar thing seemed to be the wind in the sails of the ACO in Le Mans that was truly needed. We've already covered a little bit of this. I know that in what I wrote and having spoken with some folks on the IMSA side, DPI 2.0 was definitely the thing that was going to go forward until Aston Martin said, hey, we're going to do a hypercar. We know that, Graham, we'd had the general Toyota commitment. Yeah, we don't know what it's going to be because you guys don't know what it can be because you haven't gotten your act together yet, but we'll be here. Great. We know that Jim Glickenhaus, a couple of folks have asked, hey, why wasn't he mentioned? Why wasn't his SCG 007 mentioned in the hypercar announcement, which hopefully you can address? We know, we basically had Toyota and Jim. That was the hypercar folks we expected to show up. Toyota and Jim. Who are you rooting for? I'm going for Jim today. That wasn't enough.
World's biggest automaker against world's smallest automaker, which is quite hilarious.
Dude, Jim's making a car. we know that that's not enough to launch a brand new category. Then, obviously, with Toyota expected to bring at least 2, who knows if they're going to make customer cars available, but with Aston Martin signing on very recently, that then kicked the potential of DPI 2.0 out of being a fallback / necessity, and really gave Hypercar the momentum it needed to be confirmed and announced. We then had, which I don't know if a lot of folks actually bothered to report this, but we had our friend, well, I shouldn't say that. Actually, that's sent with irony. Our friend, Mr. Collis, by Collis, announced that they're going to be building a Hypercar supercar and then making that into a competing Hypercar as well. So in theory, between Jim, between Toyota, between Aston Martin, and good old Colin by Collis, we in theory have 4 manufacturers and more to possibly come. I mean, that seems to be a good thing, Graham. And also, if we're basing what we've seen with the Aston Martin Valkyrie, there could be some pretty good-looking cars. Maybe GTE Pro-ish, though, if we look at the Toyota example. I don't know. What are you left with now with a couple of days to process?
Well, okay, let's start from the very beginning. It's a very good place to start. Jim Dugganhouse, I sincerely hope Jim comes because he's enormous fun and I like spending time with him in any paddock. And if he wants to come to the paddock that I'm working in, he will be more than welcome. Colin Collis, don't care. Just don't care. I don't care. It's as simple as that. Great, they're there, blah, blah, blah. Colin, if you're listening, come and do it seriously, and you'll get my admiration, but don't care. As for the Toyota, slightly underwhelmed by the look of the car we've seen today, but that's not to say that's the finished article. And of course, that is certainly a mule. It certainly is not the final race car. Let's wait and see. That is a prototype-based car. It is therefore interesting that the car we've seen has got 2 seats in it. So let's wait and see what the actual program is going to emerge for Toyota. That will be a full factory effort. It will be 2 cars. Remains to be seen whether or not we will see any privateer cars that come with that template. There is one, by the way, before I forget, one interesting further tweak to the regulations that emerged in conversation this week, which is that the manufacturers will not now have to provide a cost-capped customer version of their hybrid drivetrain to other customers. So that's another one where I think they've in fairness tried to keep the cost down as best they possibly can. That was clearly something that was worrying some of the manufacturers in the room. Then we get to Aston Martin. The Valkyrie is going to be a stunning automobile. Make no mistake about it. It's going to be road car based. Therefore, there are going to be at least 20 road-going versions of that. I have personally spoken to 3 people on the waiting list for that car. There is no doubt in my mind there will be something more than 20 of those cars on the roads, or at least in people's collections.
So you personally have spoken with those folks?
I personally have spoken to at least 3 people. Hashtag me personally. To people who are Valkyrie customers. That is a real thing.
Should I tell folks I put in 3 orders or no?
No, I don't know, because that would make 6. And then
1/43rd scale, but yes.
Yes. But no doubt in my mind that it's going to be a serious effort. It will be 6.5 litre V12, normally aspirated engine with no hybrid drive. That is going to be a weapon. Make no mistake whatsoever about that. And here's the news, there will be more than 2 of them. There most certainly will be more than 2 of them. Aston Martin in their own announcement said that they will be committing to at least 2. I think a fair number of people are aware there is a customer waiting in the wings. Beyond that, what else have we got to look forward to? Well, Daily Sports Car and Racer in the next 24 hours will update you on where things stand with McLaren. I can tell you that sources at Porsche are making very encouraging noises, as long as this formula proves that it can work, that we're not going to be dealing with a living nightmare and hell of technical regulation, restriction, balance of performance, that means that gets the headlines and the competition doesn't. So the potential is there. without a shadow of a doubt, the potential is there that this could be a formula that produces grids of real numbers. The only comparison we've got, let's not forget, is either what we've got currently, which is one factory and a gaggle of privateers, or what we've got in IMSA, which is just into double figures with 3 factory-backed programs and a customer program, the Nissan program. So the numbers we're already hearing are broadly similar to what we've actually got in IMSA, and are certainly better in terms of factory-backed cars than we've actually got for the current WEC. So already encouraging. It has potential in exactly the same way as DPI Gen 2 has got potential. The interesting part of this, to my mind, is the journey that we've been on to look through and beyond those Plan B. I mean, and to deal with some of those Plan B. There were 2 Plan Bs have been suggested with various people in the industry, in the powers that be, and for that matter in the media, taking sides on which Plan B there should be, and if indeed there should be a Plan B. GTE Pro Plus, 100%, was all about keeping Ferrari in the room, and it's my view that didn't come from the WEC and it didn't come from the ACO, so you're left to decide which partner in the operation was basically trying to throw everything into the wind to keep Ferrari in the room. The second part of it was DPI, and yes, absolutely, I'm aware of who in the room was plugging DPI as being a very viable Plan B. As it turns out, at the moment, it seems a Plan B was not required. We then get to the point where you can join into this conversation now, MP, about the varying tones that we've heard from IMSA post the Hypercar announcement. At the time when I was speaking to Scott Atherton, very positive about the potential for there being a performance window that might see the opportunity, particularly when we get into Gen 2 DPI, that the performance window was such that there's not dissimilar lap times available to what we currently understand to be a hypercar and what we currently understand will likely be the performance level of a Gen 2 DPI. And that raises some interesting prospects. Potentially, if we can keep all the guys in the room, whatever DPI Gen 2 emerges as being coming to play at Le Mans, and vice versa with hypercars coming to play, for instance, at Daytona. That would be an ideal solution. Am I confident we're going to see that delivered? No.
Yeah, so that's going to temper things a little bit here, James, with your question. And this is another amazing how much things can change in less than 24 hours. I have absolutely solid intel that conversations between all of the sanctioning bodies you've mentioned, French and American, were had not too long before the Friday announcement, confirmation of Hypercar. That private meetings were held, got all the senior folks together, and there was a definite overall willingness and air of positivity, knowing that Hypercar is still over a year away, knowing that DPI 2.0 is a couple of years away, but there was a definite collegial willingness, since we're working on the rules right now and nothing is baked in 100%, let's make sure that we give both of our type of cars, our prototypes, the flexibility, most likely through hybrid power, but let's give ourselves the flexibility so that, since it sounds like we still want to do this, you can bring your type of cars over here and play at the 24 hours of Le Mans. We can bring ours over, play at the 24 hours of Daytona, and who knows, maybe even more events, but let's make sure, rules-wise, we give ourselves that latitude in the future, play together, fun for all. For the stuff that I read from some folks on the French side, Friday, right after the press conference, there was nothing remotely that followed what I heard was said in the meeting, the private meeting. So we have a case where, as you said, and I read, listened to the interview that both you and our man Stephen Kilby did with Scott Atherton, and there was great positivity, hoping that this very scenario, DPI 2.0s and hypercars being able to play together. There is great desire for that. I don't know if that has changed so much, but I can tell you that in the interview I did with Scott Atherton many hours later, his tone was not as warm with me than it was in speaking with you guys. My guess is that the very contrary thoughts being spoken from the French sanctioning bodies might have had IMSA feeling like they had been fed yet another line of complete bull. And so, yeah, I love the idea. Who doesn't love the idea of, all right, well, if we're not going to be unified under one set of top-tier prototype rules, let's figure out a way so they can at least compete and play together, and you come to our most valuable event, we'll go to yours, everybody wins. To hear that this was let's do it in the room, and then once away from one another, it was, yeah, right. That ain't happening. We're going to do our own thing. I just wonder, to close, Graham, if and when IMSA is ever going to say, you know what, sure, we'll do business with you on the auto invites for the winners of our GTE this or LMP that in the WeatherTech Sports Car Championship. But when it comes to any conversations about combined rules or whatever else, go pound sand, man. You guys just keep pulling this nonsense year after year of, hey, yeah, DPIs can come and race here, sure. All right. And then by the time you get to the time to actually go forward, it becomes, yeah, you can bring your DPIs here as soon as you convert them to full base LMP2 spec, because we're not even going to try and balance them as they did in 2017. So, yeah, there's just no reason to believe anything that is said when it comes to working together on rules. It's been proven too many times. So, and if that's what it is, then that's fine. You just have to accept it and stop being disappointed.
I think the answer for me is that people have got to stop playing power games. The reality is we know we're dealing with factories that have a cycle of involvement in sports car racing. It's always been the case. It will always be the case. There is not going to be a rule set that sorts that out. So all you can reasonably do in that situation is to keep as many of them in the room, in the discussion, for as long as you possibly can. And the best way to do that is to make them feel welcome. Is to make them feel welcome in that discussion, is to make them feel welcome within the rule set. And if they make the decision based on whatever corporate priorities they've actually got at the time, is to let them go with good grace, let them go with a pat on the back saying thank you for their involvement, and we'd love to see you back at the next technical group, working group, so that you can actually start the conversation about your next cycle. That's not happening at the moment, and that is a massive, massive mistake. And whether or not any part of what's actually transpired this evening is part of that, well, I'm not aware. I don't know. But I know for a fact there will be plenty of internet conspiracists telling us that's exactly what's happened this evening. Don't believe that's the case. Have some suspicions that there were some odd decisions made over the weekend. And I do know that I've spoken to representatives of at least two manufacturers who are not very happy about the level of golden handshake, can we put it that way, that they've been afforded by the FIWEC.
We're going to call that the hashtag golden hand shower. What I do think, Graham, is it's really fascinating to see how an Aston Martin, I said Aston Martin for those keeping score of the twist words that I make up. I believe that's actually a fine beer, the Aston Martin. I think it's interesting that the Aston Martin Valkyrie is the single transformative agent in making Hypercar real versus not real and not going forward. I also think it's interesting, Graham, that the looks of the Valkyrie epitomize how amazing Hypercar could be. Looking at the Toyota prototype that was shown today in some video and whatnot, I was taken aback by how maybe others love the way it looks. I looked at it and said, that does nothing for me. It does absolutely nothing. Now, granted, rules could make that look more extreme, bigger fender flares and wings, and who knows. So again, it could become something so extreme it looks Valkyrie-esque, its version of the Valkyrie, something wild. But at least looking for what it could be, if the Hypercar class presents visuals that are more Valkyrie than the Toyota, I think it's going to be amazing. If it's more blandish like the Toyota, we might have some cars that actually struggle on the visuals to look any better than just a base GTE Pro, name the chassis. And if that's the case, yeah, that might be a concern. But I'm happy. I'm excited for where, if it's more Valkyrie-esque, Hypercar is going and could be. And I'm excited about where DPI 2.0 can take us. So I think there's going to be fans who win in terms of these formulas and what they could be. Bums me out to think that we might not see these cars racing together until the next rules are rolled out in 2027, 28, I think, on IMSA's case. So that's the only negative for me, the fact that we still just might have this heavily divided line. Let's go to Pasta Fazul, Paul Kruper, who asks a question that a number of people have, and this is related to the rather bizarre circumstances, Graham, which I'd love for you to speak to, of Japanese racing legend Satoshi Hoshino in the number 88 Dempsey Proton Racing Porsche 911 RSR. First of all, that vehicle found itself tangling with a GTE Pro Corvette, which certainly did not help half of the Corvette racing effort to try and win the 24 Hours of Le Mans. We then had a rather, I think, unprecedented, I could be wrong, but a car being retired because there's kind of sort of questions about the fitness or ability of an aging driver on his Le Mans debut. Take us inside this, because I think this is yet another, wow, that's one for the books.
World of the weird, wasn't it? So the accident exit of the Porsche curves that saw Marcel Fessler make violent contact with the wall, car eliminated more or less on the spot. Difficult one to call. I've spoken to not spoken to Marcel, and I've not spoken to Satoshi either. So this is done with the benefit of speaking to people in both the teams concerned as well as experienced drivers from other teams. It was certainly a kind of part of the racetrack where it's pretty tight. As to whose fault it was, well, the thing that's missing from your description is the fault was applied absolutely squarely by the stewards to Marcel Fessler. He received a €7,000 fine, 6 points on his competition license. And I don't agree with that decision at all. I have to say, I thought at worst it was a racing incident, and there may have been a tiny amount of fault on either side. Either way, pleased to hear that Marcel has come out of that relatively uninjured, although I think it rang his bell rather badly. Satoshi Yoshino, I suspect was expecting to be excluded. I'll be honest with you. I suspect he was expecting, because it was not the first incident he'd had. I suspect that he was expecting to be called to the stewards, and I think he took the fall before he felt he was going to be pushed. And I also suspect he may well have been the most surprised person at the Le Mans 24 Hours on hearing that it was not he, but Marcel Fessler that was being blamed for that incident. Old school, honest guy. I think he just realised in the final analysis that this was a race that was beyond him, and that's a very sad thing to say. But the reality is, TV makes this look easy. There is zero doubt in my mind, and dear listener, if you're listening, there should be zero doubt in your minds. This is beyond most of us to actually even get a car around there any remote semblance of speed. To do so in competition is harder. To do so in competition where you're dealing with 4 different classes of car is infinitely harder still. And whilst there are drivers that aspire to coming and taking on that competition, the reality, I think, for some of them is, I'll use the word advisedly, shocking. And I think that's what Hoshido-san found. Very sorry that happened. Very sorry it meant we lost another of the 4 Dempsey Proton competition cars. He'll be treated to another train passing in a moment. And very sorry indeed that it left, a driver I admire greatly, Marcel Fessler, with the medical light on as he kind of recovered from an impact with the wall, requiring hospital attention. Hate to see it.
Graham, we're going to go to our pal Adam Farrell as a two-parter for us. Thanks for the two-parter, Adam. He says, following Tracy Krone's huge crash in free practice, the initial report was that it had been caused by contact with an LMP2 car. However, this was corrected the next day with confirmation that no other car was involved. Adam asks, while I hope that this was just an honest case of miscommunication, it got me thinking, have you seen an increase in, quote, false information in motorsport, as has sadly become more and more prevalent in the post-truth era throughout the world in general? So I will admit, and it's actually nothing to admit, it's just a statement of fact. Since I wasn't at Le Mans, I was having to follow what other people were writing. I cannot say where it was involving another car angle came from, whether that was something said during a broadcast, whether a print or web journalist wrote that, it was said on social media. I don't know the origins of it, Graham, but maybe you could share a little bit about what transpired in terms of truthiness and anti-truthiness with Tracy's incident, and whether maybe you've seen other instances of that of late.
Okay, first and foremost on the incident, really sad that Tracy and Nick Johnson didn't get to continue their run at Le Mans. It ends, I'm afraid, this year, as does indeed Pat Long's run of 15. I think it was consecutive appearances at Le Mans. With the withdrawal of that car, it meant we didn't get a record 62 cars. We got a record 61 cars. As for what happened, slightly complicated. It was an error by Tracy, caught out by a slower moving car under a white flag. And I think Tracy went left to avoid what he thought was a slower moving car, was caught out by, I think it was Memo Rojas in the E-Deck car, no contact, turned and braked at the same time, and it was a short trip into the barrier at pretty high speed, and, I'm afraid that was that. As for the second part of the question, quite why people thought that there'd been contact, I've seen all the film there was to see at the point that we saw it through the TV feed. We did not see the incident. We saw the debris field at the end of the incident, and there was one shot where we saw a black and red car, which transpired was the E-Deck Sport car, leaving a scene of said accident. That, I believe, is because Memo Rojas was the car being protected by the white flag, was going back slowly to the pits. As to why people would make an assumption there'd been contact, I have absolutely no clue. I do know this. There are pretty widely accepted protocols in the case of any major incident about what you do and don't say and what you do and don't write. And the general principle is you wait for an official statement. That's that. Yes, you can speak to people directly involved, and that overrules Rule 1, but without that, you just wait for official confirmation to be made. Apologies, we're going to get another train. It tends to get busy about 1 a.m. around here with freight coming through.
Either that or that's just the bell of BS. Maybe maybe you're being called out for a lack of truthiness, Mr. Goodwin.
Well, beyond that, there is a very good point raised here, which is the pressure of time. The pressure of time is self-imposed. The pressure to be first is absolutely self-imposed, and it's arrogant. I'm sorry, but that's what it is. Actually, truth matters more than the overly timeliness that is sought by some. And it's not just one person, and it's not just one outlet. It is now a real-world pressure, and it's far too pressured It makes absolutely no real sense that to be first and get the odd extra click matters more than actually getting it right. It's a problem. It's a problem for our industry, not just in sports car racing, not just in motorsport, but right across the news agenda. It's a double problem when you get to a large event like Le Mans. And there's a reason for that. It's the event that everybody wants to be at. It's the event that everybody wants to be accredited at. And what that means is you do get some rather less experienced journalists. You get some rather more experienced journalists being desperate not to be blown out the water by those less experienced journalists. You have journalists that turn up to one sports car race of the year, and that's the one that they turn up to. And in those instances, they perhaps don't know the issues and the individuals involved there. There's all sorts of things that kind of get tied up with this one, but the reality is, for whatever reason, sometimes the basic rules of courtesy, the basic rules of journalism, the basic rules of common sense get forgotten, and these things come out. Whether they came out from a broadcast outlet, it certainly wasn't the one that I was in the booth for, because I was in the booth for that incident. Whether it came from a broadcasting outlet, a print outlet, or an online outlet, the reality is it's the wrong way to do this job. And when you've got people who potentially could have been hurt in those kind of incidents, it's unacceptable. Make no mistake, it's unacceptable. I'm of the view that if you've got people that continue to do that repeatedly, then there's a very good case for just taking their credential from around their neck, throw it in the bin, and not ask them back again. As for the general rule of thumb about the news media at the moment, and in particular as applies to motorsport, I just think we need to take a good hard look at ourselves. What's important here? Is it accuracy? Is it truth? Is it our own individual profile? Or is it actually the fact that we should be part of something bigger, part of actually remembering what the core values are of the job that we all do and getting to the point of doing it best rather than first a bit more often?
Raise an interesting point there at the beginning, at the outset of the standard practice is to wait for official confirmation. Do not disagree with that. There's also a bit of a handshake with that, though, and I'm going to keep this very brief. When you have press agents actively working to keep the press informed, then obviously you are in a wonderful position where you can go with the official account of whatever it is that happened, because it was delivered to you by that press agent, or it was delivered to a group by that press agent. You and I have both been in a situation where someone from the series, from a team, whatever, says, hey, could I get the 4 or 5 of you together here for a moment? And they provide whatever thing it is. We go back to our desks, write it, boom. Process works wonderfully. Isn't always the way things work, though. And that's where, if we take today, for example, the news of the number 68 Ford being disqualified is something that I heard about before it was released officially, before that information was disseminated to the media and whatnot. And in that case, it's a very simple case of contacting someone within the team who definitely was not going to be speaking on the record, but was definitely capable of saying yay or nay, knowing that it would be used in print. And that's exactly what was done, because I did not know if and when the organizers would be releasing that information and or the team would be writing about that. But the information had landed, and there was a definite question as to, hey, I don't know when, but let me see if I can get an accurate, factual account. And with that in hand, as you do and others do, it would be silly to sit there and wait for, who knows, an hour, if not longer, for something, quote, official to show up when you have just received your own official news, confirming
Absolutely.
something in what, yes, no, whatever it might be. So there's also a flip side to that of, I'm still waiting on the press release from 3GT Racing to tell me what it is exactly that they're doing this year. That is the big follow-up to their Lexus IMSA GTD program. I'm still waiting on the press release from now, I think 3 years ago, former Pirelli World Challenge CEO Scott Beauvais, who said, I've got 10 manufacturers lined since I've been booted from running World Challenge. I've got 10 manufacturers lined up to start a rival series, and we're going to kick their butt. Still waiting on that sucker. So just a little bit of a point here that you can wait and spend an eternity waiting in some instances. In others, we are well taken care of, and the relationship works perfectly. And in others, you go get your news, but you confirm it. So, anyways, that's that. Let's go to one or two final on the good old tweeters, Graham, and then we're going to move over to Facebook and say goodbye. Let's see. Ben asks, is it reasonable to expect the Hypercar 3-minute and 30-second lap time at Le Mans to be shattered by the cars that will actually appear on track? He said, I imagine Toyota's knowledge from its most recent TS050, Adrian Newey's input on the Valkyrie, SCG's aero efficiency demoed on the 003 will result in similar performance to LMP1. Any thoughts on that?
Well, the reality is that the rules will dictate that we don't get similar performance to LMP1. That is the cornerstone of Hypercar. It's the bit about Hypercar that I'm not that keen on, I'll be honest with you. There's lots about Hypercar that I do like. The slight dumbing down of performance in it is something I'm less keen on. Again, I think that's the cornerstone as well, by the way, of what we're hearing from the other manufacturers about the powers that be's ability to control this. What they mean by that is, will BOP work? Will you be able to stop absolute dominance by one factory team over another? Will we get a fair chance to come in year 2 or year 3 and be able to compete at the very top of the tree? Will the development curve be halted? Will we get to the stage where this is about competition, if not pure competition, about competition wheel to wheel? Bit more GT3, if you like, than LMP1, if you want to put it in those terms. So the theory is that a genius won't be able to make the difference. Whether or not you see that as a good thing, if you're a purist, or a bad thing, is up to you. But the idea is that you approach future prototype racing in, frankly, a pretty similar way that we've seen with GT3, GT4, TCR. Think of a number.
And here's the overriding thing to keep in mind when we're talking about car, and I'm not going to give up on that name we made up, by the way. This 3-minute, 30-second target, part of me wonders, Graham, if that is going to be a bit of a stretch to get there. What, during the race? I think we saw the fastest.
Race pace. It's race pace.
In the race, I believe we saw, was it Conway who did a 317.8 in one of the Toyotas, whatever it was, almost a 318. I seem to recall, unless it was better, and I apologize. But
317.2, it was a record lap.
2, okay. Even closer to a 17 flat. So almost 13 seconds faster race pace than what is anticipated for Hypercar. I think that 330 is going to be hard for some to hit. Just keep in mind that using this Toyota, at least what it's doing today, as the only benchmark we really have of going 13 seconds faster in race pace. On full deployment, it has 25% more horsepower than we think most hypercars will have. It is, we are going to be heavier for sure with the hypercars. So we're talking 3/4 of the power, 75% the power, heavier, and also less downforce. So slower down the straights, longer to brake, slower through the corners. This is, to your point, Graham, I don't know what we're going to see in terms of visual impressiveness with the hypercars, on-track performance-wise. I think looking at some might be stunners, just sitting there standing still. In terms of being anything close to today's LMP1, yeah, I think there might be some LMP2 drivers who are going to be, there might be some P2 drivers climbing into hypercars going, Okay, kind of matchy, a little bit to what I had before. So we'll see. I just would not expect the visuals of, say, the Valkyrie, which leads to, I think, imaginations running wild of, oh my God, it's going to go 1,000,000 miles an hour. It's going to be the coolest thing ever. Yeah. Wait and see, as Graham Goodwin likes to say. Let's wait and see.
Let me give you, for instance, okay, in terms of the drivers that we saw at the Le Mans 24 Hours this year, the closest drivers that got to that pace on their fastest racing laps, so the averaged out pace, were Ben Hanley, Oliver Webb, 329.5 for Ben, 330.8 for Oliver Webb over an average. They clearly went a lot quicker than that with their fastest laps. Tom Dillman, you're talking there the slower end of LMP1 currently with the faster driver in the car, if you'd like to put it that way. So that's what the kind of pace we're talking about. But I tend to agree with you. The more you look at it, the more you think, when you look at what might be coming for Hypercar, it's difficult to see how the physics work of this. We're talking here, 200 kilos heavier than the current cars, and with rather less hybrid boost, maybe a little bit more power, but rather less hybrid boost. It could be interesting to see, isn't it, whether or not they've got the sums right.
It's just, this is real GT stuff presented in a prototype skin a little bit, again, depending on who shows up with what, but just mindset-wise. The original idea, as I received it, was, cool, we're going to take prototypes, make them look road car-ish, knowing that there could also be road car, actual true road-based hypercars converted to compete with prototypes, but just mindset-wise, we're going away from real prototypes, things that change, the highest art form of every year. There's a different this and different that, and it's an evolution. It's not a truly lockdown, homologated thing to death. We're going away from that to what is really, instead of this, prototype mindset, P1 mindset, but just dressed differently to, this is actually going to kind of sort of just be, really impressive GT cars. But this is GT. This is not, as I see it, not really going to be a vaguely like-for-like exchange with what we have today in prototype, and the top form of that being LMP1, either hybrid or non-hybrid. So, all right, Graham, let's see, where else? We got a couple questions here. We can probably roll a whole bunch of them into... I'm just trying to think whose question. We'll go with Matt at Matthew Briggs 1. He says, I was surprised that there were so many safety cars in the race after the introduction of full course yellows to the race director's toolkit and the wish to avoid safety cars being expressed. I assume the cases warranted it, but I'm curious as to why. And he also says, more importantly, welcome back, MP. Thanks, Matt. And again, we got more than a couple questions here across social media, Graham. Thoughts on all right, so last year we really screwed the pooch on GTE Pro. We baked in a win for Porsche like it's never been baked before. No conspiracy theory, just, that's who the victor ended up being. But yeah, we saw the worst outcome of the multiple safety car deployment, etc. thing last year. We're going to add full course yellows to try and fix that a little bit, etc., etc. Didn't seem to have a whole ton of safety car running around this year, but it still seemed like, man, chance can bake in some results that might not be too favorable. What are your general takeaways on good, bad, more changes to have?
I think you always need to take a look, and I think there are probably more things that need to be considered. The issue, of course, has always been, we're not dealing with a race. We're dealing with 4 races. We're dealing with a long racetrack. We're dealing with very high speeds. We're dealing, in the case of the Porsche Curves, for instance, with a part of a very fast racetrack with very limited sight lines. And whilst there are a number of tools in the armory of race control, ultimately the responsibility for the safety of all concerned, both in the cars and, for that matter, the intervention and the intervention crews and the track marshals, that responsibility for their safety lies with race control, and they take that extremely seriously. I do think we could do with looking again at exactly how these things can be sorted out. I got involved in, I wouldn't call it a Twitter spat, but quite an interesting exchange on Twitter today about
Twitter
this very
spat
subject.
Acronym TWAT?
No, in this case, certainly not, because it was Frank Walliser, actually, who disagreed with my take on what actually happened last year. Stand by it. The reality was safety car directly affected the outcome of the first part of the race, and Porsche cashed in on that by running the perfect race thereafter. The reality again here was that we saw on numerous occasions where the safety cars, we had 8 of them during the Le Mans 24 Hours this time, did affect meaningful gaps. It did for a while break up that fantastic train of GT Pro. My God, that was a race. You know, not 3 or 4 cars, 10 cars, 11 cars. And at one point we had just 2 left in the fight, and as things turned out under the next caution, because of where it fell in the pit stop cycle, we got back to 7 or 8 cars in that train. But look, you know, there are two schools of thought that need to meet somewhere in the middle. One is safety is paramount. 2 is we're here to provide a show. And ultimately, I think ultimately the safety side of things has always got to take precedence. But equally, we have to show, I think, a little bit more respect than we currently do to the fact that this is 4 races within one race. I've heard all sorts of theory, conjecture, potential answers to the problems that this provides that might provide a more constructive answer to it. What I value is the fact that every single 24-hour race we cover, whether or not it's the Rolex 24 Hours of Daytona, whether it's the Spa 24 Hours, a race that I think has been denuded of a lot of its interest because of the way in which the rules have affected it. The Nürburgring 24 Hours, which is next weekend, and I start my kind of trip via a trip back to the UK there tomorrow, and the Le Mans 24 Hours are fundamentally different from each other. And I think there's space for a bit of radical thinking, perhaps, about the way in which you introduce caution periods here. I am pretty tired of seeing good racing interrupted by 2 and 3 minute gaps with safety cars at Le Mans, for instance. And, you know, I'd like to see some computer simulation done about what it is you could do constructively with a 3 safety car system to ensure that what you retain are the class battles that actually should be paramount. Yes, it's about the overall race, but it should be about the class racing too. One plus, by the way, nothing to do with the safety car side of things, but it came up in a lot of Twitter discussion overnight, was one person complaining that they weren't seeing enough of the leader. Frankly, I think the way in which the actual footage was provided from Le Mans this year was a massive improvement. We saw the racing where the racing was happening. If the racing was happening in GT Pro, which it was for a hell of a lot in the 24 hours, then that's what we saw. If it was in GT-AM, to a lesser extent, we saw that. LMP2 the same. And if we were getting wheel-to-wheel racing in LMP1, then that's exactly what you saw. That was a positive change. It's that change in mindset, I think, that is required, that appreciation that a safety car or a full course yellow or any kind of caution period can radically affect a class's race that needs to be thought through with sensible people who are open to a bit of open thinking. That's where I've got the most hope, MP, because this is an area, more than probably any other major area in modern sports car racing, where we have seen different sanctioning bodies not hiding behind the not invented here rule. That they have been prepared to look at what's worked elsewhere and to trial that in their own backyard. I'd like to see a bit more of it. I'd like to see the kind of racing we saw for hour after hour after hour after hour in GT Pro at Le Mans this year happen just that bit more often without being interrupted by somebody else's accident.
I love you, Graham Goodwin. You, of course, are referencing the awesome directorial choices to show the leaders in classes as depicted on the official ACO app / WEC app, the official for pay app, which was geo-blocked from North America so that we could not hear you or who else? Alan McNish.
Alan was there. We had Peter Dunbreck 20 years after his accident, and you heard that obviously on the day at Le Mans during the week. I have to say, it was astonished that it was his broadcasting debut, but Jamie Campbell-Walter, ex-Creation, ex-Aston Martin Racing driver, 2013 WEC champion, had great fun with Jamie. Martin Haven, and come back at Le Mans from Jim Roller. Great to hear his voice again, and titan of sports car racing broadcasting in the US, and previously with Radio Le Mans, of course. But we had an absolute ball. Thoroughly enjoyed it. It is
so for those who didn't have that feed, my dear friend, all the things you described. So I'm going to throw this out. We'll get to this. This is going to be our lead when we move to Facebook. Although we do have a comment here from our pal John Sable, who always sends in great stuff. So I'm just going to suggest. This is fully Pruett's own penalty system. Next year, we are going to do away with time penalties and exclusions. Anyone who runs afoul of the rules will be forced to watch without interruption. No bathroom breaks, no getting up from the couch. You must sit for 24 hours straight and watch from start to finish the Eurosport feed. I guarantee you no one will ever run afoul of the rules at Le Mans again. Anyone who does and is forced to watch all 24 hours, I promise you, Graham, they will do everything in their power to make sure they are never forced to sit through that again. It will be the greatest cheating or infraction deterrent motor racing has ever seen, and I would suggest to other series, World Rally Championship, IndyCar, NASCAR, Formula E, do away with all penalties, all of the existing penalties. Watching Eurosport's Le Mans coverage is the new global standard of punishment. I'm telling you, we will never hear you are actually going to be able to get rid of race control and scrutineers. They'll no longer be needed. So unfortunately, we're leading to high unemployment. Our pal Bo Barfield, Eduardo, etc. I mean, just you name it. Anyone in Formula One, they're gone. No one will ever think of having to put themselves in the position of watching the hottest of hot garbage. And there are a couple exceptions during that broadcast, which I'm going to get back to. A couple of folks I thought did fine work. Oh my gosh, Graham. Cannot tell you how bad it was. But before we get there, let's go to our pal, Right Turn Lover. Look, man, Boo Shoes, Hammer Emporium soapbox is getting some good use. Thank you, Christoph. You being the hottest of hot trash among drivers, it's only fitting that you help me stand on that for a little mini rant about Eurosport. Let's go to our man, Right Turn Lover, to close the door on Twitter. Non-TV related questions. He has two. He says, have the ACO and the WC mentioned Glickenhaus in their announcements as well? They've tweeted that they'll be there in 2021, hoping this is not a sign of things to come in terms of small manufacturers. So I know we wanted to circle back on that question we had from a couple folks. And Right Turn Lover also asks, I presume now that Hypercar is official, do you expect LMP2 and GTE to have to be slowed down?
Right, first things first. No, they weren't referenced, but then none of the manufacturers referenced in the ACO's announcements because those announcements hadn't been made. I can tell you, because I have spoken to, electronically at least, I've spoken to Jim, and he is in contact. They've acknowledged his interest. There is dialogue between the Glickenhaus organisation and the ACO. That was that one. What was the other question?
Other one was, as we wait for the train to go by. So the other question was, now that Hypercar is official, do we expect P2 and GTE to be slowed down?
I think the answer on P2 is yes, and the answer on GTE is no. The key to it is just how much slowed down are they going to be. It is around this race pace issue, so it's not around the qualifying times that we've seen in LMP2. It's very much more about the race pace. We have heard all sorts of numbers, 7 to 10 seconds I'd heard before. I'd like to think that's not true and not necessary. So let's wait and see. 7 to 10 seconds for me would be a disaster.
All right, so we are going to pivot, my man, away from Twitter. Thanks to everyone who sent in questions there. We're actually going to pivot from the good old tweeters to the book faces with our man John Sable, using the first thing that we got related to North American TV coverage. John said, between commentators putting down other series, a director who spent as much time showing pit crews watching TV as showing cars, and a producer who was dead set on making Tom Christensen look like a fool, I wasn't impressed with the TV coverage. What say you? All right, John. So, A, big thumbs up there. That's a perfect 280 characters or less assessment there. And then you asked for a little bit of clarity on that, Graham, and he said Eurosport feed on Motor Trend here in the U.S. So let me move over to the good old book face, and we have a follow-up to this. I will mention that I did start to write a commentary on this, so I don't know if it will get published or not, probably. But some of the themes here mentioned are things that I've actually already written with, I believe, an intro that starts off with joyless, mean-spirited, clueless, and bewildered. If you tuned into Motor Trend's coverage of the 24 Hours of Le Mans, I reckon a good 30 minutes of useful commentary was heard. Let's go to Ryan Terpstra, who advances what I've written here. And so I will mention up front that while I am very happy that Graham and I, to end the 2018 season of the Weekend Sports Cars, agreed that, there's one particular clickbaity outlet that we really are not fond of, and rather than just bringing them up when they piss us off, let's just not talk about them at all, which I think we've been pretty good at doing. It's another thing where you want to talk about form. It's generally not good form for reporters to go at other reporters, for broadcasters to go to other broadcasters. Since I was not a part of this broadcast, since I genuinely just watched it at home, I'll be the bad guy here, Graham, so I won't ask you to weigh in. If you can, if you want to, but I'll be the guy that says dickish things because I was just a spectator. No, I'm serious. I was just a John Sable, a Ryan Terpstra, MP, watching at home.
MP, here's the point. I've not seen it.
Okay.
I mean, I was in a booth, 2 booths down. I've not seen it, so it's perfectly fine for you to have a conversation with our audience about what you saw and I didn't.
Great, and since you're going to have a train in the background, I'm actually going to mute you here, sucker. So, and I'm going to say such horrible things about you, and you can't even respond. So I'm just going to go ahead and take this because, again, I was just a fan watching. So let's go to Ryan Terpstra, and thanks for sending in a bunch of great stuff, Ryan. He says, I hate to submit this one, and I feel a little bit bad doing it, but it seems necessary, and that's kind of what I was mentioning. Normally, broadcasters don't go to other broadcasters. I have done commentary for the 24 Hours of Le Mans, both on radio with Radio Le Mans, and then also the 2017 event on Fox. I think I did about 22 of the 24 hours. So I've been in the booth. I'd like to think I know a little bit about this stuff, but not as much as others. But nonetheless, since I was just a fan, as Ryan's mentioning here, feeling a little bit bad about going there, I'll just go ahead and go there. He says, with respect for how hard I know that everybody works, the sneak peeks behind the scenes also made it evident that what they do isn't easy. With that said, here's a listener soapbox brought to you by Bushu's Hammer Emporium. With respect for your position in the industry, Graham, Stephen and Marshall Kilby, not Marshall Kilby, Stephen Kilby, no commentary is necessary. Ryan goes on to say, I did not enjoy the 24 Hours of Le Mans this year. Motor Trend 2018, now last year it was actually called Velocity. The channel changed names after Le Mans to Motor Trend, which is an American automotive magazine. So I don't blame Motor Trend in any way, just simply they took over the channel. So this is a legacy thing. Ryan says, Motor Trend in 2018 was the first crack for a new broadcast in the U.S., and it was tolerable. It had been a year, but the last few races on Motor Trend carried the world feed featuring our very own Graham Goodwin. I expect to see the world feed interrupted by whatever ad breaks and potentially some more of those studio segments, but what I got instead was the Eurosport feed, not the official ACO WEC app feed that Graham did the entire time there. An hour into the race, Eurosport went to their first studio segment. The GTE Pro battle was raging, and we lost 12 straight minutes of racing. I get the need for advertisements. Why on earth would you stack them on top of a studio segment that long and not space them out a bit? Every single time they cut to the studio, we lost 10 plus minutes of the event. The worst one came after the number 7 Toyota pitted for the second time in the final hour. Was the finish exciting? I don't know. As the excitement ramped up, they took all the fun out of it. My second and most significant issue with the Eurosport broadcast was the fact that they didn't seem to have a clue. That's something else I mentioned in my piece over and over again. The only WEC race I was able to see in full, thanks to the TV deal we have here in the U.S., was the Sebring race. I'll admit I'm not the most knowledgeable about the WEC, but I knew things were missing. Let's start with the fact that during the last hour, they apparently lacked the resources to have someone look up the last lap the number 7 and the number 8 Toyotas had pitted. So they would then know how many more stops were needed and approximately when they would stop. That's fundamentally one of the most basic things a broadcast team needs to have at their fingertips. Maybe the number 8 will have to pit, and maybe it'll have to pit for a splash of fuel, so maybe the number 7 has a chance. We don't really know because we don't know what we're doing. He said they also proclaimed that the number 92, Porsche had lost the WEC championship due to running in 10th and needing to finish 7th, oblivious to the fact that the non-full season entries didn't count for points. That was the clincher that the team there, that was the clincher that the team that was here only cared about this race and nothing else and just didn't get it. He says, lastly, I'd like to point out some of the unsung heroes of the motorsports broadcast. I didn't know how badly we needed them until we didn't have them. I'm talking about pit lane reporters. Ryan says the number 8 Toyota kept having some fluid coming out of the car during the night. Maybe you could send someone to the Toyota garage to see if they'll tell you what it is and if they're concerned. Maybe they won't answer you, but they definitely can't answer a question that you don't ask. Something else that's evident of those who do this for a living on a broadcast is the fact they have access to teams and drivers from the commentary booth. This commentary booth relied on the hashtag #AskLeMans Twitter feed to supply them with information on the penalty about the number 3 Rebellion, and they couldn't explain the penalty. He says, to all pit lane reporters, I've always appreciated you. I appreciate you even more after missing you this weekend. He then closes by saying, Marshall, I should have just listened to you, muted the TV, and tuned to Radio Le Mans. But when I went to sleep and didn't watch the last few hours live, I didn't know what I'm going to do next year. But I promise you, I won't be listening to Eurosports commentary. I'll rate this as the worst broadcast I've ever seen. They make the last few Indy 500s on ABC look professional. And for those of you who listen to my Week in IndyCar podcast or know anything about IndyCar, at least in the States, ABC's Indy 500 coverage definitely ranks as about the worst thing possible. All right, so let me come back to a number of points here raised by Ryan, and I realize that this is an international show, so I will not try and take up too much time on what is a domestic issue here in the U.S. of the Eurosport feed that we receive, Graham. So with Speed/Fox going away and this new TV deal being struck between Velocity and the WEC and ACO for Le Mans, it's great. The thing we've gotten back that we lacked for a really long time was 24 hours of uninterrupted coverage on a single channel. It had turned into this spin the wheel of change. 2 hours here, 3 hours there, back here, streaming, linear, just a mess. Nonetheless, you could at least follow it if you had the ability to get all those things before. So with the move here to Velocity, what's now become Motor Trend, cable channel, this has been the equivalent of what we've gotten with ESPN and Formula One, whereas what we had up till the changeover when it left NBC Sports and went to ESPN We had a dedicated coverage team. Lee Diffie, David Hobbs, Steve Matchett. And whether you liked that or you prefer what we have now, which is the Sky Sports F1 on ESPN, the parallels are identical. It's a prepackaged thing with no influence whatsoever by the host in the U.S., in this case, Motor Trend and an F1 ESPN. What's presented, end of story. And so you're kind of stuck with what you got. And I think many folks have found with ESPN and their F1 coverage, it's actually pretty darn good, fairly authoritative, a lot of smart people, a couple who maybe aren't too lovable, but regardless, it's a quality product. Whether you like some of the personalities more or less than the previous, fine, quality is there. What we have here, Graham, the thing you didn't see that Ryan mentioned is this bizarre format, which is something I've written about as well, where Neil Cole, who I actually enjoy, and I think Neil does a good job. They have Neil and Mr. Lamar, Tom Christensen together in a trackside booth. And they would cut away to them about every 2 hours for about 10 minutes or so. And TK, by and large, served up with stuff from Neil, would try and analyze the race, give some insights. Here's a crash, here's a pass, here's what's happening. So Tom's trying to be the insider. Got it. Liked that. I thought it was good. As Ryan mentioned, though, they'd cut away from the action altogether. So they wouldn't do the picture-in-picture, where in the corner they would still show you the live race going on. It was essentially an on-track coverage blackout. Not good, especially when a race is raging on and there's great contests happening in classes, and all of a sudden, boop, all right, off we go to the booth. Again, I don't blame TK. I don't blame Neil. Again, I liked what they did. Just whomever's making production decisions, the fact that you're cutting away from the race for a good amount of time each time, I don't know who ever thought that was a good idea. Just madness to me. But where things go a little wonky, and this is the stuff that was insufferable, and I disagree with Ryan on this part where he said last year's was okay. I thought last year's was the worst I'd ever seen and didn't even realize, Graham, that it could get worse, but it did this year. In the booth, and realizing that during the 24-hour race, you're going to have a rotation, right? Same people don't call all 24 hours. So there were cycles of folks that came in and out. I really loved the work that our mutual friend, the crazy Damian Faulkner, tried to do. Damian tried to bring some real insights and explain some things. When it wasn't Damian, it was often another Le Mans experienced racer, Sam Hancock, right? And I thought Sam did a really good job and was trying to bring some great insights. Unfortunately, and this is separate from the Neil and TK booth, unfortunately, they were surrounded by some of the biggest morons I have ever heard speak into a microphone. And these were, by and large, I believe, the same exact morons that I heard last year. This, as Ryan mentions, not taking my advice of mute the TV, listen to Radio Le Mans, you're going to have a wonderful viewing experience. I can't claim to love every single voice that I hear on Radio Le Mans. I'm sure folks said that when I was on Radio Le Mans. So I'm not making any statement about it being perfect. Nothing is. The one thing you get, though, stylistically, is insight and knowledge. Hey, this person's on pit lane. They're going to ask smart questions. They're going to make you feel as if you are a part of the race and know what is happening. From a strategy standpoint, there are folks in the booth who are going to say, hey, I'm seeing this trend. Ooh, I'm wondering if they're going to try and triple stint and eke out an advantage doing that. Hey, this driver is at X amount of drive time. Wonder how they're going to try and shuffle and figure out who's going to get in to make sure everyone complies. Hey, I see here, this thing is happening. Here's a trend. Hey, this person's just run 3 laps, all fastest laps. Boy, they're putting in a remarkable performance. And now the gap has come down from A to B. All the things you come to expect, the heights that have been set by Radio Le Mans, and I'd also say back previously with Fox and Speed, with some folks, both just general color analysts and those with real insight, watching for trends to bring the unexplained portions of the race alive. Those were reserved for every 2 hours during approximately 10 to 12 minutes with Neil Cole and Tom Christensen. And even that was not super insidery because often they would be doing the recaps, Graham. So what you had outside of those every 2 hour, roughly 10-minute visits into the booth with TK and Neil was a total absence of explaining any of the insidery bits that most sports car fans who would tune in have come to expect. Instead, we get blathering on and on and on, not by Damien, not by Sam, but every other moron chosen to be in that commentary booth, who I would argue the average listener of our show who might have never spoken into a microphone possesses far more knowledge and ability to then present information to the rest of the world than those who are actually paid and presented as those who should be steering this conversation for 24 hours. It's mind-blowing. So I made a couple notes here in the thing that I've written. And granted, I'm not even at a rough draft part. But there's one part, let's see. During one unfathomable stretch, the lead commentator complained about being unable to hear the pit lane reporter who, since the start of the broadcast, was nearly muted. Many hours later, the commentator, live on air, belabored the point, drawing full attention to the broadcast's shortcomings, and then took time to celebrate himself by calling out his efforts to get the problem fixed. In an epic close to the unintentional comedy, the commentator, then seeking praise from his fellow analysts, asked what they thought, and was met by a genuine response that his colleague could not hear what he asked. So, hey guys, we're giving you crappy coverage because you can't hear and we can't hear. Hey, I just got it fixed. Aren't I a good boy? Give me a cookie. Hey, did you see that I fixed that? What? I couldn't hear you. I mean, this is some Abbott and Costello. This is some Three Stooges stuff. And so, again, just continuing the little notes that I made here. While this exchange might come across as somewhat funny, it wasn't. And as someone who does a small amount of commentating and analyzing on TV, the, quote, "we can't hear you" routine was everything that should not make it to air. It was ripe for using the talkback channel, which you know and others who do broadcasts know well, which speaks directly
Absolutely.
to the producers of the show that is meant to be off air. So this is just one section where you go, you're genuinely calling out how bad you are, then wanting a cookie for fixing something that you, again, should be speaking to your producers about. And then, funnily enough, it was Damien who was like, I can't hear what you just said. And he wasn't taking the piss, which was pretty hilarious. So here's another thing. And again, this is just, last year I was live tweeting how horrible this was. I couldn't do it this year. I just couldn't do it. I needed a bit of a break. But here's just one other thing. And I apologize if I'm going too deep on this, but I'm just trying, this is all not just for the sake of criticizing. This is just trying to put a spotlight on something that is so bad. I truly hope some fixes are made, knowing that this is, again, for an international English-speaking feed, not just North America. But if you want to help kill international sports car racing more than it's already been killed here, just keep going, man. Keep going with this nonsense. So here's one other thing that I wrote. And this, yeah, I would have punched the guy if he had done this to me. In another head-scratching scenario, the host raised a question regarding drive time limits, all with zero knowledge of the subject. Without asking whether his colleagues in the booth could answer, he threw to, and I wrote one analyst, this is Damien, he threw to one analyst in a gotcha style of presentation, which left Damien floundering and embarrassed. Another analyst, happened to be Sam, wanting to help the audience with information and possibly trying to release some of the pressure of the toxic situation created by the host, admitted he did not know the answer and would need to look through the rules to find it. Again, this all took place on air. And so we have the host genuinely clueless and then not even asking Damien, again, on talkback, or you just cover the mic and say, hey, mate, do you know anything about drive time? I'm going to throw this to you. And if he had, Damien's eyes would have probably gotten big and said, hell no, don't give it to me. But instead, he just dropped it in his lap a little bit cruelly. Damien basically was like, Sam then tried to help. And then on air, you can kind of sort of hear him, I don't know whether it's using his thumb to swipe up or down or flip through a book, whatever it was, but you essentially are hearing dead air of him trying to go and find the answer to this question. In terms of etiquette, that is not how you work. That is also not something you present to the world. And you could maybe say, Graham, well, this is a 24-hour race. There's a lot of time to fill. Trust me, I've seen it and heard it done. And folks, do not just take this base of at least we said words on TV. That qualifies as presentation, doesn't it? No, man. This was the worst. And the other thing, too, which I mentioned a little while ago, joyless, mean-spirited, clueless and bewildered. That's what it was. That's how it was received, Graham, as this thing where if you listen to Radio Le Mans, I believe if you once listened to Speed/Fox, you would have heard love, reverie, warmth, passion for this. This sounded like, with the exception of Neil, Tom, Damien, and Sam, sounded like folks felt as if they were being punished having to be there for 24 hours to talk about this. It absolutely came through in the broadcast nonstop. So I'll just tell you this. Ryan's assessment, I think, might be the assessment of many who know to expect more and have received more. And if our friends at Motor Trend want this to be something that takes off, if the ACO and WEC want the 24 hours to be something that really gains every year, they will realize that calling one of the many folks, whether it was part of the Fox/Speed broadcast, Bob Varsha, Calvin Fish, Jamie Howe, Brian Till, Greg Kramer, Tommy Kendall, Justin Bell, or name many other presenters who might have the weekend off. If you don't start to bring quality there, since we have had the bar set so high by Radio Le Mans and by what you and your colleagues did on the official app feed, you're just going to kill this thing.
Wouldn't that be tragic? Let me give you my take on this. I can't give you a take on the other broadcast, and that's because I think I spent 16, 17 hours of the 24 actually in our booth, either commentating or indeed doing some of the things you were complaining there, correctly complaining, were wrong. And that was following up themes, finding information, making sure that systems that we put in place to work were working properly and were updated. You go prepared. You have a knowledge base. If you've not got a knowledge base, you make sure you've got the sources to gain that knowledge available. But most of all, more than anything else, it's a team. It's a team. You lean on each other. I mean, I wouldn't presume with Alan McNish, with Peter Dumbreck, with Jamie Campbell-Walter in a booth with me to be the one that is going to explain the nuances of how it feels to drive a race car, the challenges that are presented in a given situation. But they might legitimately lean on me on those regulatory sides of things. So that's what I go prepared for. But you're absolutely right. The most important thing, particularly when you're dealing with a broadcast of that length of time, is the ambience. It is the tone of that broadcast. So I will find an opportunity to go back and listen to what was actually said there, and I'll happily give you my feedback to it. But I'm not avoiding it in any way because it's embarrassing to do so, or it's not done to criticise your colleagues on another broadcast station. It's simply because, to be blunt, I was too busy doing my job to listen to other people doing theirs.
The old "I had a job to do and did it" excuse. Whatever. Here's one which was sent to me from Cody James Crow, but I think you can answer this one because I believe there was a fairly definitive answer given. He says, do you ever think Ford will give Chip Ganassi the green light on a possible DPI program? And if so, who do you see taking over behind the wheel?
Chip Ganassi. I think we know the answer to that one, don't we?
Ain't happening, my friends. Is not happening, unfortunately. Ford, at least for now, I've heard, definitely not going to be doing a hypercar or a DPI. I'd say there might be a better chance of hypercar right now than DPI, unless there is a change in hybrid power. Let's go to Jason Gore, who says, just home from a great event, but somehow feel cheated out of a possible rightful winner, says both Aston Martin and Toyota. He says, however, I don't want that to take away from a brilliant event. I don't know if we really got into the Toyota angle, the possibility of was there some sort of manipulated finish there. You have any thoughts on that, Graham? I know it's easy to fall into conspiracy theories. I'm not a big fan of them. Do you think there's anything to that, or do you think that's just lazy thoughts?
I don't think there's anything to it. I think my take on what I was seeing, what I was hearing, the feedback I was getting from my colleague who was on site down in pit lane is the shock and horror amongst people that I do know professionally in what transpired there would seem to indicate that it was a real-time horrendous cock-up. I cannot explain why there were multiple mistakes made, but what you do know that when you get into the stage where a gathering problem and a solution that you expected to have a particular effect that actually almost had the opposite effect, that panic can set in pretty quickly. But you know, I'm sure you guys, a lot of our listeners, heard the tone of the engineers, of the drivers, of the team management there. I cannot believe that was anything other than a real error. And the effects, in particular on those three drivers, were horrendous. That may be the only opportunity any of those three guys gets to be in a position to win the Le Mans 24 Hours. And there is not one person on the team, whether or not it's the guys who work in Cologne from Toyota Gazoo Racing, whether it's the guys from Orica, that have been to countless Le Mans 24 Hours between them, not one of them is unaware of just how big a deal that is. Those guys won that race. Make no mistake about it, they won that race. And the saddest words I heard in 24 Hours at Le Mans this year were the words from the race engineer to Pachito Lopez when he said to him, "Just bring it home." It was the end, wasn't it? It was the end of his hopes, dreams, and aspirations for that race. And the worst thing about Le Mans is, if you lose it, it's a whole year before you get an opportunity to go back again. And who knows if the circumstances will ever fall your way again.
I felt so badly for Mike Conway. I thought he was the star performer of all.
The gun. And by the way, just so we're clear, the data follows that through and then some. Mike was by a distance the fastest man across the whole of the LMP1 class, and by a distance. You know, a couple of things worth mentioning here, by the way. First time since I go back and check my it's first time for a long time that we've actually seen the two lead cars on the same lap. It's the first time since 1983 that the first two cars home were from the same team and on the same lap. It's, you know, these things don't happen. And for it to happen in a situation like that, and particularly to Toyota Gazoo Racing, and for Kaz Nakajima to be the other man involved here on the other side of that equation, what must Kaz have been thinking at that moment? You know, it's horrendous. And I just hope that those three guys get the opportunity for the payback from this race that Kaz Nakajima got after his terrible experience crossing that line.
Let's go to Robert Piley Jr., who sends us in. He asked us last week as well. It says, how have the other teams at Le Mans, Graham, taken to Corvette Racing's, quote, lunchtime ritual? That being blowing the big train horn, I believe.
How have they taken to it? Well, it's a nice reminder that it's lunchtime, for starters. It's bloody loud, I can tell you that for one thing. You don't miss that. Must have been around for, a decade or more now, the train whistle?
I think, yeah. Sounds... I think so. I think it's been about 10 years or so.
I think that there are various things that kind of emerge at Le Mans. It is horrifically hard work for these guys over, much more than a week. In some cases, these guys are there for more than 2 weeks. But it's very hard work. Most of the guys, they've got their own friendship groups within their own team. Because the way this industry is, there are going to be people that you possibly only see at Le Mans that work on other teams or for other manufacturers. It is a fantastic community feeling in that paddock, not helped in recent years by the ludicrous structures that are now built at the back of the pit garages, which means it's terribly difficult if you're not actually part of that team to get access to that garage. So that's not just the big factory teams, that's the smaller teams as well. It's something I think that, it's replaced camaraderie with ridiculous mock polish, and it just makes everybody's life more difficult. But how have they taken to it? I think they probably think it's a bit loud, to be honest with you. We get enough loudness in a week of racing at the Le Mans 24 hours without a bloody train whistle. But it does add some character. It does add a little bit of America, if you like, to it. And by the way, before I forget, I'd like to say this with you listening. I want to say a big thank you to Corvette Racing, and in particular to their PR, Ryan Smith, for his efforts in getting, one, the decals that appeared, I think, on 15 cars this weekend, and two, to make sure they're on. A factory car is no small thing. But it was Ryan, bumped into him. He was out there looking for a missing charging lead or something. We were there looking for batteries as we arrived last Saturday at Le Mans, and instantly agreed that he would take charge of printing the decals that Andy Blackmore had actually designed. And I had a merry afternoon or two going down and chatting to your good friends and mine up and down pit lane, and there were plenty of takers.
Just amazing. Thank you to you guys for doing that. My wife was so surprised and just stunned. Just amazing to think. And I said, sweetheart, I also love the fact that despite covering the 24 Hours of Le Mans for 10 years straight from 2007 to 2016, never had my name on a car, but you, on the other hand, you're on a quarter of the field going into this race, so clearly they got the right Pruett covering parts of the cars.
Well, the alternative decal was going to be a picture of your hairy ass, and actually they all turned that down, mate. So I'm afraid it was a winner.
61 Bigfoot sightings, not something that folks needed to see.
You want to hear something? Well, before we get into that, though, there's one more thing I need to do to torture you a little more with this, because this is an important part. And I'm sure, Marshall Pruett, you've thought of this, but if you haven't, I'm going to get the amusing moment when you do finally think of it. There are going to be 15 fantastic scale models of those cars in just a few weeks' time, and they will feature those decals.
I need to start saving money. That's the one thing that comes to mind here. Oh, my God. Graham, we're going to grab a couple more to wrap up here. We could do this all day and all night. For those of you who sent in things that we don't ultimately end up getting to, hopefully the routine is send them back, send them in next week when we call for questions, and we will do our best to get to them. Sometimes it takes a couple of weeks, but we get to your questions eventually. Let's see. All right, here's an interesting one. Douglas Holtzman says, the question may fit in the newly created, quote, dumbass category that he just invented. It says, MP and GG, when taking quotes and putting them to print, do you ever take into account the origin of the English being used? He says, say MP interviews someone at Aston about Hypercar. Are they, quote, finalizing plans with a Z or finalizing with an S? Or vice versa with GG and, say, an American like Mark Rushbrook from Ford. How do you deal with that, Graham?
I would always put it into English, the English spelling, I'll be honest with you. There have been occasions when there's been an exception to that. The other thing I would say as well is when there's obviously an error in the English, that is, for instance, the way that French is structured, I will quite often make sure that it's tidied up a little, but I will never, ever change the meaning of a quote. Never, ever. I've seen that done in tabloid fashion outside of the racing media. I've been the victim of it as a ex-government press officer. That's not something we do. You ask a question, they give the answer. That is what you, as a reader of my material, have a right to expect, and someone who's answered the question has absolutely a right to expect from me. But generally speaking, we're a UK-based organisation. Tyre has a Y in it, Finalised has an S in it, because that's what my general audience would expect.
What kind of English do you speak, Englishman?
The Queen's English, sir. Queen's English.
Well, we've got a king, and his name's Donald, so... Douglas, yeah, the short answer is usually it's just converted into whatever your domestic readership expects. So when I have received, when I was doing editing, when I would receive something from someone from the merry birthplace of Graham Goodwin, the England, and would receive things with TYRE throughout, I would do a Control F for find, TYRE, and then do a control whatever it is, replace with TIRE, because that is, again, at least what us folks here in the colonies happen to expect. So, yeah, just kind of normal form there. I'm just trying to find a couple more. And again, I wish we could do this all day, but it is past 2 a.m. for you, Graham. And I think we might be I think your battery might be on 3%, and you and Ryan Smith can go back to the Carrefour and look for a new lead, but you're not going to find it on this one. Mike Jablow. Seems that IMSA's attempts to play nice with the WC series has taken a setback with the Hypercar announcement. How do you think IMSA will react to this? Maybe cancel the WEC event at Sebring?
No. Not going to happen. And there's a good reason why it won't happen, by the way, because the event at Sebring made good money, for one thing. So, the commercial realities come into play as well. Let's wait and see how these things are going to come forward. My conversation with Scott Atherton was interesting as it always is on a whole range of fronts. And I think a conversation in a month or two's time with Scott might be more interesting.
Your point is exactly what it is. Now, this is the biggest, most profitable, most everything Sebring has seen. There's no way they are not going to have that back. I don't know if it's going to be as happy singing and dancing in arms as it might have been in March. Granted, I'm still getting my hearing back from that event, but I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen in the future in terms of happiness between all the organizations, but I do think it makes too much business sense for that to go away. All right, going to grab two more. Jonathan Wesley says, what do you consider to be the most important attributes for a driver to compete at an elite level at Le Mans? Says, physical exertion and stamina are obviously key. Remember the 2011 Audi Alan McNish ad. But mental strength, the mental strength required, especially piloting an LMP1 hybrid, must rank at the top of the scale in worldwide elite sport, especially with the risks involved. I think you touched on a couple, Jonathan. We're at a place where seemingly every driver, if you check out their Instagram feeds, 50% of them are in the gym, cycling, doing something about improving their physical fitness or maintaining a really high level. So that's just become expected and the norm. we're talking about stamina, physically as well, I think that's just become the norm. I tend to think of stamina, though, in your description here, more of performance, and that being consistency. So if we're talking about important attributes, in some classes like LMP2, those cars are quick. They're very quick. But I don't know, even in DPI, to be honest, Graham, I don't know how many drivers you would get who would say, this car has pushed me to my limits. Just there, I have no more speed to give. As a race car driver, I'm at 100% of my capability to generate speed in this car. I've not heard that. I've heard that, yeah, I'm getting 100% out of the car, but a P2/DPI compared to an Indy car, an F1 car, it's a lower level. You're not having to explore outer boundaries of talent to get the most out of these P2 DPI prototypes. P1 hybrid, I think those cars would definitely start to venture into that, ooh, we're getting into a scary space if I'm really on a maximum attack 3-minute, 14-second quali lap or whatever it might be. But then we also have the ability, Jonathan, of, particularly in race mode, can you do that lap after lap? Now, obviously not the 3:14s, but pick whatever brutally fast pace and maintain that every single lap. That's really an attribute that is looked for and highly prized. So I'd put that very, very near the top. Like the fitness, though, that's kind of become a bit of a normal thing, too. So much time is now spent on simulators, whether it's the big multi-axis ones that look like you're in a flight a true like aerospace simulator, or just folks at home with a really good steering wheel bolted to a desk. Drivers in general are turning so many more laps today than they were in the past that there's a higher level of execution in general that most drivers can achieve. I think if we're talking sports car racing and endurance racing, an attribute that's really now maybe number one is the dog don't bite attribute. I mentioned this in IndyCar talking about Takuma Sato. He's someone who was capable of amazing speed, but for so many years the narrative of his career was, then there's going to be that little thing, don't know where it comes from inside of him, but that dog's going to bite. He's going to make a mistake. He's going to do something that washes away a result, throw it in the wall, or just whatever it is. Pass on the wrong side when it was clear that was never the way to go. Driver gets by him, loses the race, whatever it might be. He's rooted most of that out, but there's still that little element where you go, man, there's something's going to bite here, and it never quite goes away. There's some drivers that have that, where you go, boy, should I go left or right? You know, let's talk about the Marcel Fessler incident with the Dempsey Proton Porsche. I mean, that's certainly not characteristic of Marcel, but it's something that folks will remember. Folks at Corvette Racing might go, okay, I don't know why you thought that was on, but okay. So again, I'm not trying to say that Marcel's skills are now in question, just saying drivers who have a few too many of those incidents that come to mind, Jonathan, those are things that can really separate folks from getting top-line opportunities and those who do not. And so I'd say if we're looking at endurance racing and attributes, that consistency of brutally fast laps and being able to do it forever if needed, that's one. The second one is definitely not having those dog's going to bite type incidents where you go, I can trust you. You're going to have to make a million decisions in this race. Where and when to do this, how and when to pass, etc. Can I trust your judgments? And that is really what makes a pick the driver, Graham, a Patrick Pilet, a Richard Westbrook, run on down the line. These guys, you go, man, this guy's always employed. They're always employed at the highest level. Why? Well, these are the trust factors and the consistency factors that really stand out. And I'll throw one other thing, and I don't know if it's an attribute or just that meaning something that can be developed, or if it's innate. But really, the third thing is technical feedback. There are some who can put a car on pole every time, but not help you develop the car to be that fast. And then there are others who are going to help you make it faster than ever and then put it on pole. That's something that folks look towards more and more and more, it seems like, every year.
Well, I'll give you one excellent example of that, and it's not necessarily the most fashionable, and that's Daniel Serra. Now, Daniel won the race in GT Pro with the 51 AF Corsa car, and that means 2 wins in 3 years in GT Pro with 2 different factory teams. Not a name that's particularly well known outside of the core racing teams, but the reason why he's that good is because he spent years before that doing Dunlop tyre testing for year after year after year, developing that skill set. And you're absolutely right, it is that melding of all these different technical skill sets, as well as being an excellent team player, that makes the real package. And it's a very tough job indeed. These guys do a marvellous job to stick with it for 2-3 years, let alone the likes of Ollie Gavin with the better part of 20.
Graham, let's close with a question from James Fox, who says it's the first time submitting a question, and he believes there's another James Fox who has submitted, though, so we might have a pair of Foxes named James, which is pretty awesome. And I'm just saving this one for our last question because I think it maybe rounds up a few others and also provides a little bit of clarity on something that can get very confusing, a.k.a. car, a.k.a. Hypercar. So we'll close on this. And again, if you have any questions we didn't get to, please send them in for next week. And we will get to them, if not the week after. James says, specifically, questions about Hypercar and the new regulations. He says, road car base designs for a race car that will require 20 road-going units built within the first 2 years and a prototype chassis that is free of restriction on numbers being built. Is that correct? Can you explain the machinations of what Hypercar is meant to be, either road-based turned into racing or pure racing turned into nothing because it's pure racing?
Well, you're exactly right. That is exactly the regulations as I understand it. So for the sake of arguing, the Toyota, which is, as we understand it, a prototype base, will not have to have 20 road-going versions of it. I'll come back to that in a minute. The Valkyrie will. Valkyrie already has got those buyers. That said, the car that we've seen in the video released by Toyota Gazoo Racing, with Toyota driving the car at Fuji, had two seats in it. So are we going to see road-going versions of that car? I suspect we probably are. Or if not road-going versions of it, certainly extreme track versions of that car. So let's wait and see what emerges from Toyota. The whole point of this, though, is it's supposed to be a catch-all for as many manufacturers as possibly you can draw into top-class sports car racing. That means prototypes, as in racing prototypes. It means road-going hypercars, and it means concept cars. So whether or not you are Aston Martin, McLaren, Porsche, operating at the top end, these halo cars, or whether or not you're the more white goods end of things, Kia, Hyundai still have concept cars featuring their top end technology. So it means that you've got a route into that category with relevant looks and relevant technology, whatever the size of manufacturer. And by the way, I didn't miss out Glickenhaus. I think they fit absolutely right in there. This is Jim Glickenhaus seeing this as an opportunity, rather the opposite to more or less everything else, to increase his production levels to about 20 cars for a prototype, a production run. So the concept, the ideas behind it have got validity. The key to it now is their ability to deliver that rule set in a meaningful way to maintain the level of competitiveness across what you quite rightly described, James, as being radically different bases, and to keep the budgets capped at around the 20 million euros per WC season that they've told us that they can.
And the final part to Mr. Fox's question, and finally, can either purebred race car or road-based hypercar run as a hybrid or non-hybrid?
Yes, they can. They fundamentally can, and that's what we're going to see with these first two programs that have been announced. The Toyota will most certainly be a hybrid. I mean, I've said it before on the show, I'll say it again. I regard that car as being TS050 light. That's basically what that car is. It is very much the same kind of technology as we've seen in its purest form in the TS050. The Valkyrie, as far as I understand it, we're talking there about a rear-driven, powerful hypercar where the vast majority of the performance, the meaningful track performance, comes not just from the engine, but also from extreme aerodynamics. That's the exciting part of this, if you like. The smarter bit of it is where they are trying now to tone down the advantage of hybrid without losing it altogether. It's that recognition that there are certain parts of the performance of a hybrid race car that you would find, as we've seen with the OT, almost impossible to balance in real competition, that punch that those cars can get. So the change, and I think it's a good one, is the restriction on the speed at which hybrid boost can be used. And that's particularly going to impact in wet weather. So on slick tyres, it will be 120 kilometres an hour that you can deploy the hybrid boost. In wet weather, they're still defining the value, but it'll be between 140 and 160 kilometres an hour. And that is because the Toto will deliver that hybrid drive through the front axle. And you can imagine, can't you, that let's call it the 750 horsepower car with drive toward four wheels is going to be rather more effective in wet conditions than a car with 750 horsepower to just two wheels. So they're looking at sensible, deliverable solutions that will help to make these cars compete better head-to-head. It's all about competition. It's all about sustainability. And I guess the thought that I would leave you with Hypercar is think Hyper GT3. Think that. Think about the mechanisms that have been used to bring GT3, massively different GT3 platforms, into the same race and keep them there. That's what you're looking at now in terms of balance of performance, but in a whole different league of complexity.
That is sleepy Graham Goodwin, who thankfully has not fallen asleep. Please write that down, documentarians. Asleep in his plate of fromage. Definitely want to thank our awesome and amazing partners at Cooper Tires, also the Justice Brothers, and also thank you again to Janetta Cars for joining in last week with the podcast. Finally, I think we might need to thank Graham, the most valuable sponsor this week, that being Christophe Bouchou's Hammer Emporium, because I at least stepped up on the good old soapbox sponsored by Christophe's Hammer Emporium a couple times. So maybe that's overdue. It's all that pent-up frustration and not being able to do my own show for a couple of weeks.
I can add one just brief point on the Inside the Sports Car Paddock.
Yes.
On the Inside the Sports Car Paddock, we did feature Peter Dunbrack on the 20th anniversary of that airborne trip into the trees at Le Mans. What I forgot to mention at the end of that is who one of his teammates was in that car.
Why couldn't it have been him? Oh, Lord. All right. Well,
good night, my friend.
Thank you, everybody. Again, thanks for those who sent in questions. Thanks to everybody who allowed us to get to the questions we got to, and thanks to everybody who will send in the ones we did not. Once again, next week, I am Marshall Pruett. That is Graham Goodwin. Good night.